All right, so let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us to our fourth wave of open data seminar. I'm Stefan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of the GovLab and also a research professor at the Tandon School of Engineering here at New York University. And I'm delighted to host today's session that will focus on making data AI ready. And I'm especially delighted that so many people have registered, and we will also record this because we also heard from many others that could not join, but that they would love to receive the recording afterwards so that they can also have the pleasure of learning from the wisdom of the panel that we have gathered today as well. Before we start, a little background about the fourth wave of open data and about GovLab as well. So at GovLab, we have an initiative which is called the Open Data Policy Lab, which focuses on how do we support governments, the private sector, civil society, and academia in how they go about unlocking data for public interest purposes. And so within that context, we've been focusing on open data and the evolution of open data. And a few years ago, we launched this report about the third wave of open data, where we identified that the evolution of open data has been going on in kind of waves. And the three waves that we've identified was the first wave, where we had kind of freedom of information. The second wave was really about providing access to government data, open government data. And then the third wave, where we also realized that it's not just about open government data, but it's also about providing access to private sector data for reuse in the public interest as well. And as you can see from this very brief chart, each wave builds upon the other wave and provides kind of additional characteristics in terms of how data is made available and accessible in ways that serves the public interest as well. Now, a year and a half ago, we also started focusing on, of course, how does generative AI actually impact open data? And that's why we called and wrote this report on the fourth wave of open data, which was kind of still a question mark, is to what extent does generative AI actually, on the one hand, support democratizing open data, and on the other hand, to what extent can actually Gen AI also, how can open data also improve Gen AI as well? And so we see this as kind of a dual place where, as I said, on the one hand, open data can be more democratized as a result of Gen AI, but of course, Gen AI can also benefit from having access to open data as well. And so, as you can see from the report, this is, of course, anyway, multi-layered, where open data can support multiple use cases. And that's also what we focus on in the report, where we look into a variety of use cases where open data can actually benefit can benefit generative AI. But we also have seen that Gen AI can actually benefit open data in various ways as well. And if you're interested, you can kind of look at the curation of examples of the fourth wave of open data on our repository, where we, on an ongoing basis, try to feature initiatives that are interesting and that really indicate that we may actually have arrived on the fourth wave as well. Now, when we focus on the fourth wave, there are kind of four elements that we feel are important. The first one is, of course, to what extent is open data actually AI ready? Because when we spoke with many people about, anyway, how is open data supporting AI, the question was, well, is open data actually ready to support AI? And to what extent do we need to make efforts to make open data AI ready, which, by the way, is the topic of today. We've also been looking at new ways on how open data is actually moving towards kind of the data commons, where not all data is accessible, but is actually managed and governed in ways that aligns with kind of expectations from communities. And then we also see, of course, that Gen AI has the potential to make open data more conversational through interfaces, chatbots as well. And I think the other big question and the big lesson from the current fourth wave is that quality and provenance have become far more important when we talk about open data. And so it becomes kind of front and center when we start talking about accessing open data for AI purposes as well. Now, in order to deepen and to really take note of recent developments, but also contribute to the ongoing conversation about the role of open data at a time of AI, and how do we actually make Gen AI also support open data, we decided to hold a few seminars. And the seminars that we are holding focuses on kind of four issues. One is about, anyway, what are some of the barriers and pathways? The other ones are about, anyway, how do we make open data conversational? How do we go and develop data commons? And of course, it's also about how do we make data AI ready, which is today's topic. Now, within that context, we also recently worked on trying to advance the FAIR principles, which typically focused on findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And from our point of view, in the current day and age, we may actually want to add an R, which is really about ready for AI. And that's also what we're going to talk about today, which is really about how do we make data ready for AI. And at GovLab and the Open Data Policy Lab, we also have a particular interest in that because we recently also launched kind of a challenge to create new data commons that provide access to data that are AI ready. And so what we learned today, we will also make sure that we integrate in the challenge and in our work moving forward. Now, enough said from me, because now we go to the real experts that we managed to canvas to today's seminar that will focus, as I said, on how do we actually make data, and specifically also open data, AI ready for a variety of use cases. We are delighted that we have managed to bring a few experts to the table. And let me start by introducing Zhamak Dehghani, who is the CEO of NextData and has done a lot of work on issues of data mesh, but also issues of how do we actually develop data products that are AI ready. And we will talk about that in a second. I'm also delighted to have Stefan Baack, who is a senior researcher at the Mozilla Foundation and was also one of the lead authors of a recent paper and report on how do we actually make open data AI ready, and Chris Shaffer, who is the vice president of technology of BrightQuery, which is a company that works a lot with statistical agencies within the US, but also globally on how to make their data AI ready as well. So with that, let me dive straight in and start with Stefan, really reflecting on your recent paper that you also wrote with a whole bunch of colleagues, where we really started to focus on how do we make open data AI ready. And so eager to hear from you, Stefan, what were kind of the big lessons learned in terms of current maturity of open data, but also in terms of what will it take to actually make open data AI ready and join the fourth wave of open data. Over to you, Stefan.
Yeah, thank you. So I should maybe start with saying that this workshop, I mean, the paper was based on a workshop, first of all. And the original idea behind the workshop was that we knew that Eleuther AI was working on a new data set. I mean, for those who don't know, Eleuther AI is famous for creating the Pile, which was an open training data set for large language models. It was essentially an open source recreation of what OpenAI did as a training data set for GPT-3, which is the model that powered the first published version of ChatGPT. And we also knew, and that caught our interest especially, that they wanted to make this successor of the Pile only use public domain or permissively licensed data. And that was very interesting for us because less and less information is published about the training data of models from big AI companies like OpenAI itself or Google and others. And we thought it's an interesting statement against the claim, especially by OpenAI, that you cannot make performant language models without copyrighted material. So We ask Elus AI if we want to do a workshop together around the release of this new data set, where they describe how they did it and what challenges they faced in doing so, and then discuss with a bunch of builders that also build open data sets in the space to come up with like normative and technical recommendations for open LLM data sets that hopefully provide some sort of blueprint in the future to create more data sets like this, data sets that only use public domain or permissively licensed content. Now, in case you're wondering why haven't I heard about a new dataset from Elus AI recently, the dataset that is now named CommonPile, it has not been released yet. And that became also obvious during the workshop. So what we did instead is I interviewed Elus AI and people working at a French AI startup called Players, because Players around that time published a data set called Common Corpus, which I'm not sure if it was the first one, but one of the first LLM training data sets that only uses public domain data. And that was like very similar to what Elus AI did. So I interviewed people from Elus AI and Common Corpus, wrote short reports that were sent to the workshop participants as a basis for discussion. And then during the workshop, we discussed in groups the challenges and best practices along the different steps in the production pipeline of a training data set, like data curation, data processing, etc. And the report basically summarized those discussions and was written with inputs from all those 30 participants. We had 30 individuals at this workshop working on different stages. Like we have people from Creative Commons, nonprofits like Ushahidi, AI companies like Cohere, etc., etc. Okay, what did we find, first of all? And I would like separate the findings in like the challenges and what can actually be done to improve the situation. And I mean, first of all, the challenges, I think I would summarize all the challenges that were identified as a lack of scalable solutions to identify and acquire this kind of data. Scalable is really the key word here because there's a lot of public domain or permissively licensed content that has never been used for AI training, simply because like acquiring this and also putting this data in a format that is suitable for AI training is a lot of manual labor at the moment. So if we only talk about public domain content, I mean, just on a basic level, identifying public domain content across jurisdictions is difficult because you have different laws and regulations for when a work enters the public domain in general, which is the reason why Players for Common Corpus, at least the first version of Common Corpus, limited itself to content that was published, I think, before 1884. So they're very conservative, making sure this is really old enough. But LLM builders obviously typically don't want to train their models solely on data that is this old. They want newer content as well. And there actually is a lot of newer public domain content. I mean, for example, from governments that publish content that is public domain by default. But you also have things like in the US where copyright laws or claims expire when they're not renewed every 20 years. And Elus AI, when they created CommonPile, they found that there are actually thousands of works in the US alone that are in the public domain because those claims have never been renewed. But identifying those works and then getting a copy of the text in a format suitable for training LLMs is very challenging. Which brings me to another general problem with public domain content, especially. A lot of this content has never been digitized, or it is only available in PDF files that have no or only bad OCR. I mean, OCR meaning optical character recognition, which is necessary to get the text out of those PDFs to train your models on. This is just public domain. When you talk more broadly about permissively licensed content, if you want to make a data set that is only using, for example, CC BY content, there are repositories for that. But if you want to go beyond that, things are getting tricky also very quickly. One of the things that Elus AI is working on in CommonPile is writing a tool that tries to extract relevant licensing information from HTML pages. And that also, I mean, it's easy to identify if someone embedded like a Creative Commons license somewhere on the website. But then correctly identifying at scale to which part of the website those license information applies to. Like, for example, you have a blog post with an image embedded, and the image is CC BY, but the text of the blog post is not CC BY. Like, identifying this correctly at scale is, again, very difficult. Then you also have the issue that a growing number of websites is now using terms of use to govern whether and how the content of the website can be used for AI training. And those terms of use are also no scalable solutions because they're not standardized. They are not machine readable in that sense. So you need a lot of manual labor to read all those terms of use and then decide whether you can actually use this data or not. Okay, those are all the problems. So if you talk about solutions, I think most interesting for the question of how can we make open data AI ready are probably the prerequisites that workshop participants identified to make creating such datasets that only use public domain or permissive licensed content easier at scale. And the first and probably most ambitious of these suggestions is that we need technical standards to better encode preference data throughout the web. I mean, this means just technical standards that clarify not just the overall license of a website, but that really are about granular permissions that accommodate a scenario where somebody wants to use a permissive license because she or he wants to, with others, unable to use this data with CC BY, but at the same time, they don't want this data to be used for AI training, especially not commercial AI training. We need technical standards that accommodate those nuances. Well, we also need machine readable and standardized terms of use for this. The second one is removing this uncertainty, this legal uncertainty over whether content is in the public domain, especially across jurisdictions, because usually when you want to make training data sets for AI models, you need a lot of data. And if you limit yourself to only one jurisdiction for that, you run into problems very often.
Mhm.
So like clarifying this is another issue that cannot be solved by the AI community alone, but this would be a really important step to make open data AI ready. And the third one that was not very upfront and explicit, I think, in the paper, but I think is relevant for this discussion, is I think there needs to be a community made up of both AI builders and open data curators around shared interest. I think it is important that the AI community is not just a consumer of open data, but also in various forms a contributor to it. I think an interesting example is, again, players. Players identified that having better OCR, open source OCR, like there are very good OCR solutions that are closed source and very expensive to use. But better open source OCR solutions is something that both AI companies like players and cultural heritage institutions are interested in, because these institutions are also interested in properly digitizing their content and enabling large-scale analysis of this data. So they invest in coming up with better solutions for that. Also, Eleuther AI for CommentPile is using an LLM to help identify copyright metadata information in the HTML pages, and they claim they're very successful with that. So I think those are various ways where the AI community can also contribute to make open data AI ready. And I think it will be really important moving forward to have more communities around those shared interests, because if we at some point have those technical standards to create this data set at scale, I think the open data community will be really important in developing those standards and also like adopting them on scale.
Great. Wow. Thanks so much, Stefan. I mean, this was already kind of a very condensed but very insightful overview of some of the challenges. And also, I do want to emphasize is that it also indicates, of course, that when we talk about open data, we're talking about a much broader concept than what was typically kind of open government data quite often, right? And so that we now actually have, anyway, public domain data, but also other kinds of data sets with different formats that are actually of interest for AI purposes and, of course, for different scenarios as well. And also very interested and interesting to hear that indeed terms of use is becoming more and more used to actually limit access to certain kinds of data. And so, and as you know, I've written about this as kind of the potential emergent data winter that we are entering, where actually we have anyway what was typically open or publicly accessible is now becoming harder and harder to have access to as well. So let me go straight to Zhamak, and of course, Zhamak, you're the CEO of NextData. So perhaps tell us a little bit about anyway how you see this next generation of data evolving, and of course particularly then interested in kind of how do we anyway make all of this AI ready as well.
Thank you, Stefan, for the opportunity and the conversation. I first want to echo that the problems that Stefan mentioned in the, at the scale in the public domain are the problems that we've been grappling with at all scales, within organization, between organizations that have a commercial agreement, and now in the open space. So my work at NextData and prior to that has been very much focused on solving the problem of data sharing at scale in general. And the foundation of that, I mean, I've done a lot of research and a lot of work, and where I landed was really we need a federated model of data ownership, and we need to bring a bit of kind of product thinking to data and changing kind of perspective from, or imagining even data as a set of files, whether they're structured or not structured, or they're Excel sheets or PDF files, to actually a set of applications, a set of intelligent building blocks. And the reason for that is that the problems that Stefan's mentioning around discoverability, around understanding what the data is about and then how it can be used, the trust, the governance, and all of those facets that are required for ease of discovery, ease of addressability, ease of use with trust, composability of that data with other data, using it for AI to be, with semantic richness. All when you look at all different facets, we're not looking at something different than just files and the pure data. We're really looking at this intelligent block that can describe itself. It has all the metadata to describe itself. It can protect itself. It can computationally, kind of govern whether this particular use case that is trying to access my underlying data ultimately should or should not be used, even have APIs that potentially allow all that mechanism of discovery, access, and establishing that trust can be programmatically done. And we are seeing this more and more with MCPs and new protocols that allow Gen AI to kind of machines automatically discover and use, and fundamentally be able to act like a product. So that's that. When we put all of those elements together, I feel there is a shift of approach. And when Stefan is talking about standards, even a shift of standards beyond just data and metadata. We have to think about data as almost like computationally capable and intelligent set of APIs that enables its own automatic discoverability, allows access to it in different modes, allows computationally protect itself about different access, and potentially in some cases even allow the particular analysis or compute to be done on the data itself, as opposed to data being handed over to someone else beyond the control of the perimeter of ownership of that data to be computed. So I know it's a deep and multifaceted topic, but that's personally consumed my work and research. And at NextData particularly, we've been trying to solve this problem of data sharing at scale with trust and product thinking built in, with a set of technology that abstracts the complexity that sits beneath this concept of autonomous data as a product. Autonomous meaning that really it encapsulates, a lot of these standards that we need, implementation of the standards that are required for data to be auto-discoverable, addressable, accessible, and trustworthy, and ready for machines, right? Not just ready for humans to come and look at it and try to make sense of it. Hopefully that allows to start a conversation.
No, this is great, Zhamak, and again, it's a very interesting, which is anyway why I'm delighted that you could join today. A very interesting approach that yeah, almost makes it more dynamic, I would say, than kind of anyway one description of a data set, but makes it more dynamic in terms of anyway indicating anyway what use cases can be addressed by what kind of data, based upon anyway the kind of computational language you use to describe the product to a large extent. Anyway, I'm probably failing in
Perfectly, yeah.
in describing what you're working on, but I think it's super interesting. So one quick question, and then I will want to go to Chris as well, and then we can have a broader conversation among all of us. And also feel free, by the way, for the audience and the attendees, feel free to pose any questions in the Q&A, which we then can address as well as such. So what will it anyway? So what will it take to get to your kind of state of anyway nirvana here, in which we can start providing anyway access to data for reuse at scale? So from your perspective, are there anyway? I mean, Stefan clearly indicated a few steps like standards. We need to actually do community building. We need to have this kind of dialogue between both the users and the providers. So are there any elements, Zhamak, from your point of view, that you feel like, anyway, if we could accelerate this, then we might actually get to closer to where you want to be?
Absolutely. So I think I agree with Stefan that, standards always accelerate innovation, but they're also very difficult to get to because you have to get humans to agree with each other. So the length of that hopefully is in our lifetime, but we will see. In the data space, I feel the same. I have a slightly maybe opinionated approach, not so much in the open data space, but generally in data space to allow the kind of a more accelerated innovation with trust built in, is that when we think about the data stack in general, I see this like an hourglass, as in underneath that data stack, we sit a lot of different sources, a lot of different locations for data, a lot of different types of data, different ownerships of the data. And on top of that hourglass sits diverse applications. Many of them are evolving extremely rapidly right now. So for a long time, we had traditional kind of analytics that retrospectively look at the data. Then we had generation of machine learning models, similar usage of the data. And now with Gen AI, almost every month or so, we are coming with new ways of accessing data. So this experience of data is evolving very rapidly. So we have this kind of diverse top and diverse bottom. But the thing that needs to enable the interoperability from the top to bottom is needs to be a small set of, I believe, standards to enable that. And the analogy I would use that we all live through, perhaps on this call very likely, was the internet. That, with internet, we also had a lot of, applications and capabilities on digital devices underneath, a lot of technologies, hardware and switches and so on underneath, and a lot of applications on top. And you and I are capable to talk with each other right now because we have a smaller set of standards in the middle, the narrow waist of internet. So I think in the case of data, we need to discover and discuss what are those small set of standards. And I think, security and governance are part of that narrow waist. And perhaps as we get closer and closer to experience layer, the usage layer, we can kind of come up with maybe more kind of simpler API-driven, computationally empowered, this concept of a data product. So that's kind of the layer of the stack that I've we've been focusing on. But I think we need the hourglass of data innovation, a narrow waist with a small set of standards that, frankly, right now are missing. Very, very basic ones, including access control.
Great. Wonderful, Zhamak. Chris, thanks for your patience. So you've been working a lot on open government data, and of course at BrightQuery you have a tremendous amount of experience and expertise on working with statistical agencies, and more recently you launched something called opendata.org to really provide access to open data for, anyway, I guess what you call, or what BrightQuery calls, factual AI, which I think is super interesting. So tell me a little bit about, anyway, your work, first of all, and what are some of the challenges you see, and also some of the, anyway, the approaches moving forward.
Cool, absolutely. And yeah, first of all, before I jump into that, just thanks for putting this together, and thanks for inviting me as well. So I'm gonna discuss this in I guess there's three different initiatives that we're doing at BrightQuery that are very relevant to everything we're talking about now. So one is there's a project we're doing with the US government now to evaluate their data for evaluate their various government data sets for its AI readiness. That dovetails a lot with what Stefan and Zhamak, you've both been talking about. Our second one is an initiative to build a government data chatbot, and those two really, really overlap a lot. And our third one is the last one you mentioned, this open entity data set. So I'm gonna start with talking about the evaluating government data agencies for their AI readiness, because I think that has the most overlap with what we're all talking about today. So it's funny, one of the so we started out with a very broad remit, look at a bunch of government data agencies and see how AI ready their data is. And Stefan, last week we were speaking about when you say AI ready, do you mean AI ready for what? And that was a question that kind of came up really quickly, is that we have depending on what the application is, there's a big difference in what it means to be AI ready. And we decided to look pretty broadly across multiple things. So there's AI ready for training an LLM, AI ready for being able to ask a commercial chatbot and get a correct answer about a question. AI ready for, let's say we're going to build some sort of a RAGs system to answer data about, or to answer questions about structured data. And then there's AI ready for predictive analytics, or kind of more traditional machine learning, or even just AI ready for search engines. And there's a lot of differences. There's a lot of overlap. And one thing that maybe shouldn't be, but is always surprising, is there's a little bit of an everything old is new again theme. Both of you mentioned just being able to get data that is discoverable, digitally native, good OCR, having the history available. It's even when we're talking about LLMs and neural networks, and sometimes we're tripping on step one, where it's, can I even get the data out in a digital format, right? So like a good example is, I can go to the Census Bureau and I can get a document from the 1790 census, and that's awesome. But it's a PDF and it's a little bit slanted, and it's not OCR'd very well, if it's OCR'd at all. So it's a little bit, it can be difficult for, it's difficult for any kind of an automated system to work with. So one of the things that we found is like almost universal, is we have to look at the difficulty of just crawling a website, scraping data off of it, pulling information from OCR, and just traditional traditional ETL work. And this is all data that is intended to be open. This is data that is published by government agencies that's intended to be as easy to work with as possible. I think it's really interesting, also, like Stefan, what you were mentioning about being able to see copyright information, being able to see, is this data that you're supposed to, is this data you're supposed to be allowed to feed to an LLM? We're kind of coming at it from the other approach, where the assumption is that everything's published by a government data agency. You're supposed to be able to use it for whatever. But knowing the provenance, like coming at it from our approach, what we're seeing a lot is having a good known bounded data set is often a lot better when it comes to accuracy, when it comes to not having hallucinations, when it comes to trustworthiness in terms of getting factual and correct answers. Even if we're dealing with data sets where we're not even worried about copyright, and if we're dealing with other data sets, we should be. Even dealing with that, just having that very, very narrow data set where you know where it all came from, it's not only important enough to not abuse work that people put out into the wild and might not want you training an LLM on. It's also important just to get the answers right. Like, my personal background is in financial data, big financial data providers, and the idea that like a Bloomberg or a Capital IQ or a FactSet would not be able to tell you where a number came from, that it might be scraping it off of some sci-fi book. That your financials might be coming from Reddit or a sci-fi book or something else. That's terrifying to those places. Like, you wouldn't even imagine that, right? You got to know where every number is coming from. So anyway, a lot of common themes, even though we're coming at this for different reasons, different purposes. And then the last thing I want to mention is the open data initiative that we're working on right now at BrightQuery, which is open entity data. And what that means is we want to publish a set of what we call our BQ IDs, identifiers for 350 million organizations, 500 million legal entities, 800 million locations, and 1.5 billion people that are listed in like company registries, different government regulatory filing sources from all over the world. Having a way to tie back a natural language discussion of a person or a company to a distinctive entity is something that's huge in the financial data world, and it's something that is really not addressed in the LLMs that are out there right now. Having an unambiguous identifier for a legal entity.
Great, super interesting, and again, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A as well. But I do want to follow up with all of you, and perhaps have now kind of a conversation amongst all of you, really, which is about I think one key thing that comes back, and I think Stefan, you started with, which was like, it's great. This is a very manual, very intensive still activity, right? And again, Chris, it would be interesting to hear, anyway, how intensive is it to actually go through, anyway, open government data sets to decide, anyway, how do they score in terms of AI readiness and what can you do? And also, anyway, Zhamak, interesting to hear from you is like, anyway, how do you lower the transaction costs to actually, anyway, do what you hope to do, is to even build data products, for instance, right? So question is like, anyway, of course, anyway, we should probably not automate everything, but as you know, at GovLab, we also have worked on, do we actually need a new profession to be able to do this kind of work, right, in a way that anyway aligns with a set of kind of best practices, uh, and do we actually anyway do we have that profession at the moment? So it's not just about scalability; it's also about actually do we have the kind of professions that we need to be able to make all of that AI ready, and how do we then lower the transaction costs? Basically, that's kind of the the small question to all of you. But I mean, I don't know, Zhamak, perhaps you might have some ideas here, and then I go to Stefan and Chris if you're willing to address and tackle that question.
It's a wonderful question, Stefan. And I want to maybe just lowering that transaction cost. I want to maybe just pose it as with a different lens. That is actually by lowering that transaction cost, we are leveling the playing field for a lot of people who then contribute into the innovation. Because right now, innovation at scale is very much centralized to organizations that will have the money to throw all of that machinery and people to do basically to do the big part of that transaction, to take on the majority of that transaction cost, which is discover, get access, cleanse, structure, like all of that, or formulate the data into the mode that it can be used. All of that, if you think about from data to value as a supply chain, majority of that transaction cost is that upfront kind of, the part of that supply chain before that data is now ready for use and now ready use for multiple purposes. So I think, again, bringing maybe naively perhaps, but simply that product thinking into the picture and say, and I love Chris's word, well-bounded data sets. So if we have this kind of well-bounded ownership of different types of data based on the sources and ownership, and we bring product thinking to it, and we say, well, for that data to be used, now that front load of that data supply chain needs to be encapsulated and owned, and the cost of that then is incurred by the entity that is providing that data. So what would then happen is that we're, instead of shifting that cost to a centralized entity for running, thousands of data supply chains on the consumption side, we are pushing the cost to thousands of entities that they have one fraction of that supply chain cost, because they're only dealing with supply chain automation, data supply chain automation in their own bounded context. So we are leveling the field in that sense. And if we did so, we are producing data that is ready to use, is accessible through machine, readable and accessible APIs. It's describing itself. It provides its lineage. It's provide a semantic rich information, and so on and so on. I mean, these capabilities will evolve over time. I think we will end up like right now, what we're building with our autonomous data products. Every one of those has an MCP tooling that allows you to configure any technology that works with that protocol to automatically tap into these data products that they become discoverable automatically as well. So that's the first shift of thinking about this data supply chain in a more federated data supply chain with ownership of the cost where that sits. And the second part is that then how do you apply Gen AI to actually bring down the cost of that front end of that data supply chain to turn the data to product? And I think that's where the sky's limit too, right? With automation. So I just pause here because I don't want to hog the rest of this call talking about that. But that in itself is fairly magical. And we recently launched a product, and one fraction of that really is a multi-agent system that can look at the mess of your data and can propose what are the products that need to be produced, and architects basically the boundary of these data products and so on. And I think I get goosebumps even talking about it. Like that's a fabulous, like the rich space to apply Gen AI.
Yeah, no, well, thanks for that, Zhamak. And I like the passion here in how you describe it. But perhaps that's another seminar we should organize, which is exactly how actually Gen AI can help prepare and democratize data in itself, right? Which I think is a fast moving environment, both in terms of even discovery, but also in terms of then preparing and even embedding some of the controls that one might want to have in a more automated fashion. So Stefan, any reactions from your end? And then going to Chris. And in the meantime, Chris, there's also a question in the Q&A for you that perhaps we can address in a second. Stefan.
Yeah, thank you. Lowering transaction costs. I don't have anything bright on that other than, again, I think communities are important. But I think these communities should not just be made up of volunteers, but at least when it comes to public domain content, I think it is reasonable to say that there are institutions that handle public data that should be involved in that, and that brings some stability and continuity into this work, be it cultural heritage institutions or libraries or something else. And I don't know if I mean, potentially there are people specialized on doing that within those institutions. Not sure if we need new professions. Another thing that came to my mind, where I really have also no idea whether this is good or bad or helpful at all, but the role of synthetic data. If synthetic data is somewhat reliable in producing good data, that might lower transaction costs. But again, I really have no strong opinion about the potential of that because I haven't really dived into this very deeply. But it's interesting to me that it's becoming a bigger issue. I mean, this became clear because one of the workshop participants was someone from Gretel AI, which has recently been bought by NVIDIA, and Gretel AI is specialized in creating synthetic data. So it became a much bigger issue, I think, also since we did this workshop. But yeah, I wonder if and how this could help. Though it also touches a bit the question of, I mean, what you mentioned, Stefan, about like we shouldn't automate everything, and then would of course go in the direction of automating it more. I would like to see a profession specialized in this. I don't know what it would look like and where it would be positioned, but ideally it would be something that is non-profit, I think, not tied to a particular product. And that like listens to the various stakeholders interested in that. I mean, I also wonder if there's a geopolitical element to this. Now with the EU investing into or trying to invest into own solutions, if that would be something where they would be more willing to say like, hey, we want to make it easier to unlock all the European data that is somewhere in the public domain for AI training. I don't know. But yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, these are great thoughts, Stefan, and perhaps Zhamak might also and Chris have a reaction to your synthetic data. One question is, of course, anyway, what would synthetic data products look like? I think is kind of perhaps the interesting question that Zhamak might address. But Chris, over to you. So it seems like so you have this project with the U.S. government, right? But anyway, it seems to be very manually intensive, right? And so how do we lower the transaction cost for doing this kind of work to, anyway, as Zhamak says, understand, anyway, what is the current state and how do we improve the current state in ways that it's actually AI ready or becomes kind of a data product for a variety of use cases?
So I have a few different pieces to the answer to that. So one is, I'd say we'll start with, there's a recommendation that we've been giving that's easy to give, hard to implement, which is just several different data standards that we would like to see more agencies implement. So some of those are AI specific and some of those are not. So Croissant is like kind of designed for AI data standard for making tabular data discoverable and ingestible by AI. We think there's probably some more that could be done on top of that. It's a little bit of I would say it's a starter. The phrase necessary but not sufficient comes up a lot. So Croissant's one of those. We think a lot about like triplified data, where it's taking anything that's complex and breaking it down into really simple 3-part statements, kind of like an entity attribute value model, but it could be in a, we haven't chosen a specific standard there. It could be like a graph database format, or it could even be simple English, just simple natural language, 3-part subject, predicate, object sentences. And then we've got some older standards that are still very relevant, things like SDMX, which is heavily used for statistical data over in Europe. It's used by like the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, OECD. It's a really good standard for exchanging highly structured statistical data. Doesn't cover anything outside of that universe. We also push schema.org a lot, which is not really an AI standard, but it helps search engines a lot. And hey, how are you going to ingest a data set well if you can't find it? So those are some that I would say, easy to give, hard to implement, because then you've got to do it. You've got to publish data in all those different formats. Second part is maybe a little bit less intuitive, but we're generally saying like the more, if you publish the same data in multiple different formats, that is going to be very helpful. So I gave the example earlier of the census. If you could get census data in both in natural language, that's like natural language that's machine readable. You can get census data in a tabular format, like a CSV, or even just a table on a web page, and then you can track it back to that original PDF. That's not only important for verification and trustworthiness, but we might not have all of the answers we don't have all of the answers for today of how do I take every government data set from 100, 200 years ago and make it AI ready. But again, necessary but not sufficient. If you publish machine readable data and then you also publish the original PDF, that becomes training data for somebody to figure it out. Maybe that somebody's us, but maybe it's not. And the last thing we're doing is we're actually building, part of one of our government projects is building an agent to at least do some of this automatically. So what we would like to really get to is as much of this that is something that any consumer of the data is going to want. We think that should be happening at publication as much as possible.
Great, wonderful. And in the meantime, suddenly we get all those questions and we only have 5 minutes left. So let's quickly, anyway, Chris, if you could quickly reflect on the question by Martin, especially around the data set that you are preparing on opendata.org, is how do you plan on maintaining such data sets, especially given the fact that companies come and go. But again, it seems to be like you're mainly focusing on the identifier. And then Zhamak, there was one question here with regard to if you do federated kind of preparation and sharing, how do you incentivize the data holder to actually go the extra mile and developing the data product in ways that it is can be used for different use cases, kind of the business case of doing that. And then there is a longish, which I haven't fully read yet, from Mary around kind of open science, which is really about how do you identify what standard is appropriate. And also, yeah, I think the interesting question from Mary, perhaps also for Stefan, which is really about how do you bring in all those communities, like the open science community has worked on kind of open data standards, the FAIR principles. How do you, anyway, how do you bring those to the table, to similar to what you mentioned, Stefan, like the archival librarians have years of experience in doing this. How do we build that community, which goes back to the kind of community building exercise? That's how I would translate this question. And we have like 3 minutes 3 minutes left. So Chris, you want to quickly do maintenance very quickly?
Yeah, I'll try to answer. Yeah, I'll answer this one as quickly and concisely as I think I can. Biggest thing we're doing there is we're treating most facts. That includes we're treating most facts as point in time as much as possible. So for the example of a company shutting down, the identifier of the company should be the identifier of the company. And if it's shut down, it has a date when it's shut down, but the identifier doesn't go anywhere. Mergers get a little bit more complicated, but again, that's a relationship with a point in time where the relationship between two companies will have a start date and an end date. May have a start date and may have an end date. So a company has an identifier. It might be independent at one point and not independent at another point, but yeah, there's a point in time aspect to it.
Okay,
Kind of the short
great.
answer.
Thanks, Chris. Zhamak, what's the business case to actually develop those data products if the cost is anyway resides with the data holder?
I'm going to cheat answering this question. And I would say it's the same economic factors and incentives that we applied when we went to an API-based economy. When the ecosystem and the network effect and the innovation and financial benefits of companies opening up their capabilities at APIs, when we did that, there was an economic model behind it, right? We went from closed companies to open companies. We provide APIs. I can swipe a credit card today with Square and purchase products on Shopify. Like all of that, I think it's the same economical kind of incentive that network effects and ecosystems create. And of course, initially maybe opened up through B2B integration and partnerships. We're just talking about a different kind of APIs. We're talking about data APIs as opposed to application APIs.
Great. Good answer. Stefan, how do we bring all those different communities to the table? Because that's a question where it's like open data, like Chris is working on open data government, open government data. Anyway, Zhamak is working on multiple different data sets. You're working on public domain data. But they all have similar kind of problems, right? So how do we bridge those communities? And then you have open science data.
Yeah, I mean, because we are almost out of time, I mean, my very short answer would be really what I mentioned before, like shared interests is, I think, the key aspect here. Identify shared interests, like organize regular meetings between those communities that usually are not in contact with each other, and identify what are those shared interests, and then build around that. I think it's the only way really forward, unless there's an external funder coming in and throws money at everyone, but I don't expect that to happen. So I think working around identifying, of course, and then working on shared interests is, I think, the best way to move this forward, would be my very short answer.
Great. Well, thanks so much. And again, rule number one of, anyway, my moderation is to always end on time, because otherwise people will not come back. And especially the speakers, anyway, will be upset that, anyway, we abused your time. So I will end here. There are other questions left as well, and perhaps I can share these with the speakers as well as kind of a follow-up, and then we can add that to kind of the report. As said, this was recorded. We will share. We also share a blog that summarizes things, and we also have another seminar that comes up soon, which will be focusing on data commons. In the meantime, as I said, join our challenge on newcommons.org, newcommons.ai, to also look into how do we accelerate data commons moving forward. Stefan, Zhamak, Chris, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. I feel like we could have, anyway, spent a whole day unpacking this. But I think this was super interesting, learned a lot. And also, hopefully, we can stay in touch and do another one on perhaps kind of progress made, or even jointly on shared interest, as Stefan was saying, perhaps jointly collaborate moving forward as well. And thanks to all the ones that joined us today as well. Take care and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.